To the general public, Arnold Rothstein was a gangster about whom little is known. Usually his name only comes up when they talk about mafiosi like Meyer Lansky or Lucky Luciano and mention Rothstein as their mentor and investor. But this is only the first layer of the multifaceted personality of this Jewish businessman. Peeling the onion, we first discover that Rothstein was involved in the ascent of at least a dozen leading Prohibition gangsters. It's then revealed to us that he was one of the biggest gamblers in the United States and had managed to fix the results of the World Series. But that's not all. Digging deeper, we find evidence that Rothstein had serious political connections and was an intermediary between the authorities and the criminal community. And finally, he was one of the first to set up his own drug smuggling network. Today, we'll discuss a gangster who managed to turn everything he touched into money. He was a gambler, a casino winner, a bootlegger, a drug dealer, a loan shark, and every new enterprise would lift his net worth to a new level. And the more money he received, the more he invested, opening up new types of criminal activity and new ways to illegally make money. If you want to learn how one man managed to build the underworld of the 20th century, then meet Arnold Rothstein on the other side of the law. All the previous subjects in my channel had come from poor families of immigrants who had just arrived in America. They had experienced firsthand all the charms of poverty, and for them, crime was the shortest road to a better life. Arnold Rothstein took that path from a very early age. Arnold, who would later be called the Brain and the Big Bankroll, was not an immigrant. His grandfather had arrived in America in the middle of the 19th century, and his father was born in America, so his family had already gone through the stages of adaptation and poverty before Arnold was born in 1882. His parents, Abraham and Esther Rothstein, lived in New York and were typical Orthodox Jews. They honored the culture and religion of their ancestors and tried to instill the same outlook in their children, of whom there were 5. And even though Abraham managed to feed such a crowd and was a successful entrepreneur to the point that the Rothstein family could well be called rich, nonetheless, there was no way to be able to give enough attention to each child. At least that is how it seemed to Arnold, who developed an extremely selfish and jealous attitude. As a child, the future Big Bankroll hated his older brother and believed that he got all the best and more. Arnold shifted the blame for this to his parents. Gradually, a child's discontent began to turn into teenage rebellion, and if the elder brother, wanting to please his father, went to study to become a rabbi, then Arnold, despite his parents, would deny Jewish values, take the opposite extreme position and call himself primarily an American. This disobedience to his parents' intentions resulted in the fact that, not deprived of mental abilities, Rothstein was extremely reluctant to study at a Jewish religious school. The only subject that he recognized as having any value there was mathematics. In the other classes, his main intention was to come up with schemes to avoid learning anything and to outwit the teachers. Obviously, Rothstein could not last long in the traditional religious educational system. In addition, in parallel with pranks and manipulations of his teachers, Arnold began to gamble, an activity that combined his 2 main passions at the time, love for numbers and rebellion against the outlook of his father. After all, gambling was strictly prohibited in Jewish religious teachings. However, in the New York of those years, there was no strict ban on such entertainment for those who would try their luck. You could even say more. The Big Apple of the late 19th and the early 20th century was Sodom and Gomorrah rolled into one, where gambling was the most innocent of sins displayed there. Due to the fact that criminals and the authorities were intertwined with each other like lovers who had not seen each other in years, the streets of New York were an explosive mixture of brothels, drug dens, and gambling establishments, seasoned with corrupt cops and politicians and decorated by the early forms of organized crime. The wave of indignation about the decline in morality was just beginning to gain strength. There were no ban on drugs, there was no ban on alcohol, and power was often obtained not by force of persuasion, but by force of coercion, bribery, and fraud. It's not surprising that officials not only gladly covered up dark deeds, but often were the owners of brothels or gambling houses themselves. It was a time when dark and shadowy money-making activities quietly went on in broad daylight. In such a world, even teenagers like young Rothstein could easily find places to place a bet. Arnold hung around the local bookmakers, and since he was not allowed inside due to his age, he tried to attract the attention of people inside in order to bet on his chosen horse. More often than not, he succeeded, and having made a bet, he then waited impatiently outside for the end of the race. The only catch was that the bookmaker went out to him only if the horse lost, and in the case of a bet he had won, they simply stopped noticing him. Having fallen for such tricks several times in different establishments, Rothstein, via such bitter experience, came to understand how the gambling business really works and who actually makes money in it. However, understanding and applying the acquired knowledge are two different things. Arnold still continued to play, relying solely on his ability to memorize and analyze. So he bypassed bookmakers and switched to dice and card games with his peers. Such hobbies and his lack of desire to learn could not escape his father's notice, and so the father decided to take his son into the family business, pulling him out of school at the age of 16 and sending him around the country as a salesman for the company. Of course, nothing good came out of it. In the end, Arnold lost all the company wares and expense money at card games in Chicago in 1899. Returning to New York, he sold some personal belongings and used that money to rent a hotel room and avoid his father. You could say that the teenage rebellion ended in victory. After this incident, the father left him alone and basically gave up on him. In the future, they would resume communication, but Arnold would never become a full-fledged member of the family again. However, at that time, young Rothstein was not disturbed by this and actually considered this a positive advantage. He had finally thrown off the shackles of his parents and could do whatever he wanted. And he wanted to play. To keep a roof overhead, he got a job as a cigar salesman while devoting all his free time to improving his playing skills, trying his hand at everything where you could hit the jackpot, from playing cards to shooting pool. Over the course of a couple of years, Rothstein visited almost all the gambling houses in New York and gained invaluable experience in how the business works. Now he knew which establishments were best avoided and with whom it were better not to sit at the table. But most importantly, Arnold acquired dozens of acquaintances and arranged to play on the side that never loses. New friends began to invite him to games where the loser was known in advance, and Rothstein readily agreed without any pangs of conscience, as such predetermination fit into his new philosophy of minimizing risks. The most important acquaintance he made in such institutions was of the informal leader of Tammany Hall, Tim Sullivan. Sullivan had a tremendous influence in the political landscape of New York and was also the owner of several gambling houses. He and Rothstein went to the same billiard room and from time to time played with each other while discussing various matters. Naturally, in such conversations, the subject of gambling would pop up, and Sullivan was impressed by Arnold's knowledge in this matter. He gave Rothstein a job as a manager in one of his establishments. This position allowed Arnold to better understand how the game works, not only from the side of the player, but also from the side of the owner of the establishment. At the same time, he gave him a regular income many times higher than his salary in the cigar store. But Arnold Rothstein would never have earned his big bankroll nickname if he had stopped there. Having received the necessary experience, a good income, and most importantly, influential friends, he began to try his hand at opening gambling establishments on his own. It is clear that his first enterprises of this kind were not luxurious casinos with hundreds of thousands in profits, but only small places where a couple of dozen people would gather. In an empty warehouse, he equipped a room for playing dice and also rented a small apartment where he arranged card games. Not only did such enterprises bring profit to Arnold as the owner of the establishments, but he also became a loan shark, loaning money to losing visitors at very high rates. And to ensure that all the funds would be guaranteed to return back to Rothstein's pocket, he made friends with the influential gangster of those years, Monk Eastman. So if someone decided not to repay the loan, then Eastman's boys would use every possible lever to persuade the delinquent, and the big bankroll would happily share the profit with the boys. However, despite all the previously mentioned money-making schemes in which Rothstein minimized risks as much as possible, he was still primarily a player. And if you add to this his egocentric nature, this mixture often made him plunge into extremely dubious adventures, such as the one of 1908. In those days, Arnold moved in the circles of an informal group of intellectuals, among whom he earned the reputation of an extremely arrogant and selfish person. And in order to put him in his place, one of the members of the circle invited a pool shark to New York. And then, having conspired with the others in the group, at their next group meeting, he began to belittle Rothstein's abilities at pool and to extol those of his pool shark friend. Thereby, he manipulated Arnold to challenge the pool shark. The next day, they met at a pool table and played non-stop for a total of 32 hours. The winner of each game would receive $500. In order for you to understand the scale of this contest, more than $3,300 in 2023 dollars was at stake in each game. And although by the end Rothstein remained in the black by $50,000 in 2023 dollars, this case demonstrates well that, despite his excellent understanding of the world of gambling, Arnold was often overcome by his emotions and followed their lead. He challenged a person without knowing his true abilities and therefore was stuck without the ability to minimize risks because of his lack of the most basic intelligence about his opponent. In principle, Rothstein's entire life was a war between emotions and reason. He knew perfectly well how to make money. He could accurately pick profitable enterprises, but he could not control his emotions at all, which often resulted in rash acts, one of which would eventually destroy him. However, Arnold's demise was still far off in the distance. For the moment, his calculation dominated his emotional impulses. Yes, from time to time he lost money on bets or cards, and oftentimes was left with only a couple of dollars in his pocket. But this was not because he had lost, but because his money was constantly in circulation. He issued loans, invested in the ventures of acquaintances, and constantly put money to work, thereby accumulating $12,000 by 1910. That was enough to open a full-fledged gambling establishment. The only problem was that by this time, gambling in New York City had become illegal, and Arnold needed political protection. So he went to Tim Sullivan, who agreed to help on only one condition. Rothstein would have to take in Sullivan and a guy named Willie Shear as partners. The big bankroll agreed, and another $24,000 were added to his $12,000. With those funds, Arnold rented a 3-story mansion, setting up a bar on the first floor, a gambling casino on the second, and he moved in on the third. Under the terms of the agreement with Sullivan, Rothstein managed the house on his own, and Sullivan and Shear only received a percentage of the earnings. And though Rothstein was completely satisfied with everything, Shear saw deception everywhere and believed that Arnold was skimming most of the proceeds for himself. Therefore, when the first large bet of $40,000 was lost in the casino, Shear decided to appropriate all the money for himself in order to settle scores with his partner. He took the check drawn by the loser, but having cashed out the money, he did not give Rothstein his share. That only made things worse for Shear. The big bankroll didn't make a fuss or ask his criminal acquaintances to shake down his partner for the money. He went to Tim Sullivan and told him that Shear could keep the money for himself, but that his stake in the establishment should go to Rothstein. Sullivan reasoned that this was a completely fair resolution of the issue and gave the go-ahead to Arnold's idea, who transferred these conditions to paper and then caught a drunk Willie in a bar and with the words, "You can keep the money for yourself. Just sign this piece of paper for Sullivan," slipped him a contract which he signed without reading. And so, with a stroke of a pen, the big bankroll doubled his profits from his casino and kicked out an annoying partner, thus laying a solid foundation for his meteoric rise. For the next decade, the name of Arnold Rothstein would appear wherever gambling took place, and his scams would be remembered not only by contemporaries for their sums, but would also remain in the annals of history, surprising with their sophistication and audacity. After receiving the share of his former partner's profits, Rothstein began to redirect it to improving the house. Within a couple of months, he radically changed the situation, turning an unremarkable place into a gambling establishment of the highest class, patronized by the rich who were ready to part with their money. Of course, Rothstein gave them a little push in the direction of his establishment. He hired dozens of people who moved in high circles, but who did not themselves have impressive fortunes and therefore were not averse to earning extra money, and asked them to mention his casino more often. Such Rothstein agents would receive 10% of all losses incurred by the people they had directed to the casino. Most often this role was played either by pretty girls or guys who were master manipulators. And the rich suckers who were driven to slaughter in this way, like sheep, would not only lose impressive sums, but then later advise their friends to go to the excellent Rothstein gambling house. The $40,000 loss appropriated by Willie Shear, considered to be a huge loss at that time, became quite common at Arnold's casino because the new audience was ready to lose $100,000 or $200,000 at a time. It was only necessary to pour them a drink at the right time, surround them with a couple of beauties, and they would do the rest themselves. However, as Rothstein's business was booming, a storm was brewing in the justice system that could easily level everything that Arnold had built with such effort. As I said earlier, the entire industry of vice, which included gambling, operated in New York under the patronage of the Democratic Party organization called Tammany Hall. This organization, controlled by the police, which was already directly engaged in collecting money for protection. By 1910, the bribes and protection money totaled the equivalent of $40 million in $2023 a year. And it seemed that it would take more than a dozen years for such a racket to collapse. But as history has shown, this impression was deceptive. It only took a couple of years and one impulsive, snickering man named Charles Becker. Becker was a typical bad cop, constant abuse of power and corruption schemes. That is, he was an ideal candidate to become the main person collecting money from gambling houses, brothels, and drug dens. Becker worked in the field, using his mastery of persuasion to get owners of illegal enterprises to pay good money to their protectors. Therefore, when he was once again caught up in a scandal, Tammany Hall and the police brass would excuse him and release him back to the street again. Time after time. Avoiding well-deserved punishment so often, Becker began to feel invulnerable. Therefore, his methods of collecting protection money became more and more ruthless and cruel, and the conviction that everyone should work exclusively under his authority became almost non-negotiable in his mind. So, when Tim Sullivan began to lose his mind due to illness and retired, Becker went on the offensive against Sullivan's friends, who had previously been untouchables. That's how he ran into the owner of a gambling house by the name of Herman Rosenthal. He beat Rosenthal, raided his establishment, and tried his best to intimidate him, but Rosenthal still refused to pay. And then he went to the editor of the local newspaper and reported the lawlessness of the police. Before that, Tammany Hall and the police authorities, for the sake of old times and Rosenthal's friendship with Tim Sullivan, tried to somehow resolve the conflict between Becker and Rosenthal. But after Rosenthal attempted to expose Becker, Tammany strongly advised Rosenthal to shut up and give in. Rosenthal, of course, did not listen, which untied the hands of an embittered policeman. Becker hired several gangsters to kill Rosenthal. But the way he planned the assassination was the height of stupidity and arrogance. 4 bandits drove up to the restaurant where Rosenthal was leaving and shot him in front of a couple of dozen witnesses, among whom were several policemen. Yet everything would be fine because Becker could easily shut up any cop. However, the day before, Rosenthal had visited Republican prosecutor Charles Whitman, who was not controlled by Tammany and reported everything that he had told the newspapers. So this case was pursued at a breakneck pace, and Charles Becker was soon put in the dock on charges of organizing the murder. As a result, this case received wide publicity and clearly demonstrated to the public the corruption of the police and the lawlessness that had previously been hushed up. Although this case failed to establish Tammany Hall's involvement in this racket, it broke Tammany's control of the police. Now, the vice squads began to work according to their intended purpose, which meant that the owners of gambling houses could no longer work as openly as before. That's how one murder broke a huge system that had run for decades. But where some lose, others will certainly gain. And Arnold Rothstein, who seemed destined to go under with Tammany Hall if they could be proven to have been involved in the protection of gambling, instead only increased his influence as the Democrats came away unscathed. All the public outcry around Becker did not just inhibit further police lawlessness, it made it no longer possible for politicians to protect illegal enterprises as openly as before. Now, Tammany Hall needed trusted private citizens who could connect the criminal world to the authorities with minimal involvement of officials. Rothstein, who was familiar with both worlds, became one of those people. If politicians needed to find a person for a dirty job, they'd go to Rothstein, as would gangsters who needed to solve their problems with the law. Thanks to this position, Arnold's authority grew on both sides of the law. That was a situation that he gladly made the most of. For example, when one day a car was stolen from one of his friends, one call was enough for Rothstein to get the car returned safe and sound within an hour, along with an apology to the girl for the inconvenience caused thereby. Or when police raided the apartment where Rothstein was playing a card game, and Rothstein, without understanding what was happening, shot and wounded one of the raiding police officers in the hand. Not only was Rothstein immediately released, but the police apologized for the disruption of the game. The subsequent trial found him not guilty, while one of the policemen was found guilty of giving false testimony. However, it is noteworthy that Rothstein tried not to abuse his new position, realizing that even in such conditions, he did not have complete immunity. In order not to push his luck too far, he began to look for new ways to make money on gambling because it had almost become impossible to openly work in New York. Avoiding the attention of the police was extremely simple. Instead of holding the games in one place and risking complaints by the locals, new locations were assigned each time, most often in pre-rented hotel rooms. This type of business was called the floating game. However, such an enterprise could not become Rothstein's mainstay. He held floating games purely for wealthy acquaintances. His main gambling income came from casinos in the suburbs, where it was still possible to work openly. He opened the first such institution called Holly Arms on Long Island in the village of Long Beach. This place included a hotel and a casino and was located in the middle of well-kept landscaping in which a stream flowed. Rothstein lured the best croupiers in New York and the chef of one of the leading Golden Apple restaurants there, turning Holly Arms into an elite institution. It was a kind of country club for the rich, where, among other things, they could lose a couple of $1,000s in a pleasant atmosphere. The second, even more luxurious, was a casino called The Creek, located in the resort town of Saratoga Springs. Here, the casino was even more luxurious and impressive than at Holly Arms, and visitors here lost not just a few thousand, but tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. The establishment turned out to be so successful that in just a couple of years, they made a millionaire out of Rothstein, giving him the opportunity to calmly do what he loved most, bet on the horse races. For a while, he even did it on his own track called Havre de Grace, which he owned in partnership with several rich people. But Rothstein's murky schemes made his partners look bad, and they eventually forced him to sell his stake. And I must say that such measures taken by other shareholders were not groundless. Most of the time, Arnold played dishonestly. For example, there were not uncommon cases when, right before a race on which Rothstein had placed a bet, The jockey of a leading horse was suddenly changed. Of course, that led to completely different results than the bookmakers had predicted. A good example was the incident that occurred in 1917 at the races in Laurel, where the two champions, Awales and Omar Khayyam, met. Khayyam had won the competition in the past, and many had blamed the badly performing jockey of Awales for this. And in Laurel, 5 minutes before the start of the race, and quite unexpectedly for everyone, this jockey was replaced by another, and Awales won, which brought Rothstein $300,000. And although it was not possible to prove the existence of fraud, such a large bet on an outsider made clear that Arnold had inside information. In less significant races, which attracted less attention than the competition of champions, Rothstein went to more brazen measures in everything. He could bribe jockeys to hold the horse at the right moment, or give money to grooms who inserted small sponges into the horse's nostrils to make breathing difficult. All these tricks made it possible to minimize the risk of losing money as much as possible. But they were, so to speak, common tricks also used by many other dishonest players. The case of an unprecedented scam performed by Rothstein, which no one else repeated, occurred in 1921 at the races in the Aqueduct. By this time, Arnold already owned his stable, where, among other things, there was a horse named Side Reel, which until that moment was practically unknown because it had not yet raced often. Nonetheless, it showed excellent results in training. Rothstein decided to bet on it. First, he called Side Reel into a race where his opponent's past results were clearly lower than his. And secondly, the horse was brought from Arnold's stables literally 5 minutes before the start of the competition. With these actions, Rothstein confused the bookmakers as much as possible. Not only did they not know anything about the horse, but even at the last moment, they did not know whether it would take part in the race at all, since it was not present at the track. That's why the chances of Side Reel winning at the beginning of betting were listed as 50-1 against it winning. Plus, we must add the fact that at the time, bookmakers could accept bets only orally, and on that day, there were about 20,000 people in Aqueduct. So the $120,000 that Rothstein bet on Side Reel via his agents did not arouse any suspicion, and Arnold pulled in $850,000 in profit at the end of that race. In today's money, that would be about $10 million. However, Rothstein was not always able to fix the race, and luck often left him for others, which is why the large bankroll could lose tens and in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars in one race. So in cases in which Arnold could not rig the results and minimize risks, he hired a team of professional analysts who, taking into account many factors, included humidity and wind speed and direction, bet Rothstein's money, receiving a percentage of his winnings. The most remarkable aspect of this was not that this approach really brought profit to Arnold, but how he came to it all. Early one morning, Rothstein went to the kitchen in his house to get a drink of water and discovered that a man with a gun was rummaging through his cabinets in search of money. The uninvited guest did not look like a typical robber, which naturally did not escape the eye of the big bankroll who knew this class firsthand. This guy turned out to be an ordinary teacher from California, Will Davis, who had arrived in New York with $1,000 and his own betting system on which he was going to make money, but had been robbed immediately on the day of his arrival. After that, he was upset and killed time in a bar, thinking about what he should do next. There he learned about a rich casino owner who lived without security and kept thousands of dollars in cash. So David got a gun somewhere and went straight to Rothstein. Arnold managed to get the whole story out of Davis during the time when he went to get some money for the unfortunate robber. After that, he offered Davis a choice. He could either take the $1,000 he demanded, or if his system were really as good as he said it was, then Rothstein would be ready to give him hundreds of times more and pay a percentage of the profits. Davis chose the second option and proved to the big bankroll the validity of the analytical approach to betting on horses. It's also worth noting that Rothstein was not only betting on horses, He was interested in everything except football, which he considered difficult to predict. For example, there is a story that Arnold was involved in rigging a boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Jim Tunney, which brought him $500,000. But the most famous story involved the rigging of the 1919 World Series between Cincinnati Reds and the Chicago White Sox. For the viewers who don't know about baseball, the rigging of the World Series is equivalent in skill to the rigging of the Champions League Finals, the Stanley Cup, or the NBA playoffs. The story itself dates back to the middle of 1919, when several White Sox players, the White Sox were favored to win the World Series that year, decided to throw the series for a good bribe, as they were unhappy with their salaries and the unwillingness of team owner Charles Comiskey to raise them. Born as a theory in the summer, by September 1919, this idea was already beginning to become reality when several White Sox players met in Boston with a bookmaker named Joe Sullivan, who, after listening to their offer, agreed to pay them $80,000. This amount in today's dollars would be about $1 million, and Sullivan did not have such funds. So, after shaking hands with the players, he immediately contacted his acquaintance in New York, who, you guessed it, was Arnold Rothstein. Sullivan described the situation to Rothstein, asked for a loan, and promised to keep Arnold informed of all developments so that he could also make a profitable bet. Naturally, the big bankroll agreed, and from that moment on, was embroiled in the biggest scandal in the history of baseball. However, as it later turned out, Sullivan was not the first person for whom the Sox had offered to throw the World Series. A few days before the meeting in Boston, the White Sox players had been in New York, where they offered the same deal to two small gamblers and part-time former baseball players named Bill Burns and Bill Maharg, asking them for $100,000. Looking for more investors in their venture, Burns and Maharg eventually both went to the same Rothstein. Arnold, who had already sent money to Sullivan, nevertheless agreed to talk to them, appointing a meeting place in a crowded restaurant. After listening to the offer of novice swindlers, the large bankroll demonstratively made a scandal in public, shouting that he would never get involved in the proposed venture. Behind this performance was Rothstein's expectation that in doing business with Sullivan, he was sure that Joe would operate quietly. But two small players, even if they could come up with the money, would likely get caught somehow anyway. So a demonstrative refusal to them in public was for Rothstein a trump card up his sleeve in case the scam became public. However, after refusing Burns in public, Arnold immediately sent his man Abe Attell to him. Attell gave Burns $100,000 and said that Rothstein had changed his mind. Why did he do it, you ask? It's all very simple. Having given the money to Sullivan, he understood that Sullivan would not give it to the players right away, but he would use most of it to place bets. Therefore, a scenario was quite likely in which the White Sox players might consider themselves deceived and refuse to comply with their end of the bargain. But if, in addition to Sullivan, they were offered another $100,000 by other people, then greed should have outweighed any suspicions. On paper, everything seemed to be perfect. Sullivan promised the players $10,000 after each lost game, and the remainder after the final loss. Attell, who acted on behalf of Rothstein, promised the players, through Burns and Maharg, $20,000 after each lost game, and the remainder at the end of the World Series. The White Sox were happy with these deals, and threw the first two games of the 5 games that would have to be lost to lose the series. To win the series, a team had to win 5 games. However, instead of the $60,000 due from 2 groups of gamblers, the Sox had received only $20,000. The baseball players, in a rage, demanded their money from Burns and Maharg, which they in turn tried to beg from Attell. But Abe didn't give a dime. In addition, Sullivan, who also owed money to the baseball players, did not contact them then either. So, without warning, they won Game 3 of the series, knocking out the low-money Burns and Maharg, who were betting everything they had on every single game. After that, this couple simply disappeared into the air, leaving only Joe Sullivan in the game, who did not lose anything from one White Sox victory since he had bet on their defeat in the series as a whole, but who could no longer allow them to win. After the third game, Sullivan contacted the baseball players and paid them another $20,000, promising not to disappear again and pay on time, which of course he lied about. After the third White Sox loss, Sullivan went missing again and didn't pay. Instead, the baseball players and their families began to receive threats from gangsters, so they eventually threw the series, suffering the last defeat in the 8th game of the series. And while inside this scam, everyone was trying to cheat each other and rake in more money, outside, the public began to suspect that something was amiss. In Boston, Sullivan had bet large sums of money against the White Sox. In New York, Rothstein had bet over $300,000 against the White Sox through his agents, and in Cincinnati, Abe Attell had bet on the defeat of the White Sox in every single game. The Reds-White Sox rivalry was put under intense scrutiny, with many journalists and uninvolved bookmakers openly talking about the corruption of the series. However, the public outcry and the subsequent trial did not affect Rothstein in any way. Yes, he was involved in this case and even appeared before the court, but thanks to political connections and precautions taken in advance, which maximally distanced him from the epicenter of events, he did not suffer any punishment, having received, according to the most conservative estimates, at least $1 million in profit from this scam. And what is most remarkable, Arnold had essentially earned this million by proxy. Sullivan, Burns and Mahag had come to him for the money, and then they had taken care of everything on their own. Rothstein only had to skim the cream off the top. And I must say that this was not an isolated case. By the mid-1910s, Arnold was already living up to his big bankroll moniker, and he was approached every month by dozens of people who needed money for completely different purposes. On scams, on bets, on living until the next paycheck, and even for payment for the murder of an unfaithful husband. Rothstein gave to everyone and then took it back with interest. According to his lawyer, Arnold was as obsessed with loan sharking as he was with gambling or betting. He could spend all day in his favorite cafe, where people came to describe their ideas and get a loan, and then spend just as much time recovering his money with interest. For Rothstein, usury was also a form of gambling, where he put up money and then claimed the jackpots in the form of interest or something else. For example, several Broadway producers took out loans for their productions, but their productions ended up failing, so they were unable to pay back the money. Rothstein agreed to forgive them the debt if they'd insure their lives and give their policies to him. They agreed to the deal with the devil and put their lives at the mercy of the large bankroll who could easily order their murder if his further requests were not met. Usury also brought Rothstein shares in many enterprises of other people who could not pay back loans in time, but were ready to share part of their businesses. That applied to both the legal sector and in the shadow one. From one gambling house in New York, in 10 years' time, Arnold Rothstein made his way to a fortune of tens of millions of dollars. By the 1920s, when Prohibition was introduced, he was coming up as one of the most serious players in the Big Apple crime scene. He had influential friends on both sides of the law, as well as the authority of a person who would never refuse to help, even if he took his percentage for it. And soon, this fame would lead dozens of criminals to his door, many of whom would later forever leave their marks on the history of crime. As I said at the beginning of this video, New York at the beginning of the 20th century was the embodiment of Sodom and Gomorrah. But by the 1920s, the time for public vice was coming to an end. First, part of the public had rebelled against prostitution, and it had gone into the shadows. Then it was the turn of gambling houses, which had to evolve into floating games after the drugs were outlawed, and finally, in 1920, alcohol was banned. For the initiators of these changes, all this looked like a victory, like the beginning of the transformation of society into something new, bright, and not burdened by sin. The problem was that the society itself, which was not asked about any of this, was completely unwilling to give up their sins, and especially those that were prohibited by the 18th Amendment. Where there is demand, there will soon be supply, and thousands of guys with a gun in their belts all over the country began to bootleg. Naturally, the vast majority of such businessmen did not have the money to expand on a grand scale. Many were satisfied with being small-town bootleggers, and those who weren't went to people like Arnold Rothstein. Thanks to his fame as a man with money, ready to lend to them during Prohibition, the big bankroll had a hand in the development of more than a dozen gangsters, among whom were such notorious personalities like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Bill Dwyer, Dutch Schultz, Jacob Shapiro, Jack Diamond, Waxy Gordon, and Maxi Greenberg. Most often, of course, Rothstein acted as an outside assistant for these personalities, but the last three characters were for some time very closely tied to the big bankroll in alcohol smuggling. After all, loans are loans, and Arnold was not going to miss such an excellent opportunity to earn money. With Waxy Gordon and Maxi Greenberg, he entered into a partnership agreement when they came to him asking for money. At first, Rothstein even controlled the entire smuggling operation himself, but then, realizing how many problems bootlegging brings with its constant robberies and shootings, he faded into the background, only receiving a percentage of the profits. He had the same situation with Jack Diamond, who initially worked for Arnold as a personal security guard, then retrained as an escort of alcohol trucks, and then received funding from Rothstein and independently engaged in bootlegging. As you can see, the big bankroll deliberately distanced himself from alcohol smuggling, putting it in other hands and remaining in the shadows. Despite the good profits, he did not like the fact that bootlegging had too many variables for it to run smoothly. It required big ships, small boats, trucks, warehouses, and bribes to police officers, customs officers, and coast guards, and who knows who else. And if something suddenly fell apart, then the whole operation went down the drain. And don't forget about the love of bootleggers for stealing from other bootleggers. Drugs are another matter. From one suitcase of magic powder, you could earn as much as from a dozen ships with booze. In addition, the competition in this business was 100 times lower than in the trade of illegal alcohol. After Rothstein's death, the Drug Enforcement Agency would call his network the largest in the history of the country by the time. Arnold bought heroin in Europe and China and then smuggled it into the States through various means. In Europe, two men named Don Collins and Harry Mather worked for him, and in China, Sidney Steyer, Jacob Katzenberg, and George Öffner bought drugs and then shipped the product to New York City, where Rothstein sold it to other gangsters who were already retailing to heroin addicts. In addition to drug smuggling, the big bankroll was also in at the beginning of union racketeering, making a significant contribution to the introduction of organized crime into the clothing district unions. And although employers and workers hired gangsters to provide support and protection during strikes even before Rothstein got into the act, it was his funding that marked the beginning of the full penetration of gangsters into unions. It all started with the fact that in 1924, the communists turned to the big bankroll with a request for a loan for the needs of the party. Arnold agreed and gave them $1.8 million at 25% per annum, and also helped them find a common language with the police during strikes and strong guys to resist if the police moved to disperse the strikers. In order for these strong guys to avoid suspicion, they were accepted into the Communist Party and trade unions. And of course, these thugs obeyed none other than Arnold Rothstein, who could use them to pump money from the unions into his pocket. At first, this racket was headed by Jack Diamond and Jacob Organo, By the end of the 1920s, they would be replaced by Louis Buchalter and Jacob Shapiro, who, after the death of Rothstein, would take over most of the clothing unions. If you look at how the 1920s began for Arnold, prohibition, drug smuggling, union racketeering, it could be said that nothing foreshadowed trouble. He still found new enterprises, as before, and earned money from most of them. But in 1928, he hit a rough spot. At the beginning of the year, he lost about $1 million on unsuccessful real estate investments, and then began to regularly lose large sums of money. Meyer Lansky said that Rothstein during this period was like a man possessed, as if a gambling fever had entered his brain, which did not give him the opportunity to stop. It could be said that emotions knocked out the rational part of the big bankroll, despite his calculating mind having dominated him for so long. It's also worth noting, even though it's not often mentioned, that people around Arnold began to notice strange behaviors in this period, behaviors very reminiscent of the habits of drug addicts. And Rothstein's wife noticed that this year her husband's social circle changed dramatically. If earlier he had spent more time among politicians and wealthy businessmen, now he surrounded himself with gangsters like Jack Diamond and Meyer Lansky, whom he had previously only considered to be useful acquaintances. And all this foreshadowed only one thing. Sooner or later, with such a life, Rothstein would run into serious trouble. However, no one could have expected that an ordinary game of cards would be fatal for Arnold. In early September 1928, the Big Bankroll took part in a card game organized by George McManus, which was also attended by Alvin Titanic Thompson, two small-time gangsters, Meyer and Sam Boston, as well as two gamblers, Martin Bowie and Nathan Nate Redmond. For a while during the game, regardless of the hand Rothstein held, he could not win a single hand with a decent pot and started to suspect that he was being swindled. Each time he bet more and more, and finally, holding a great hand, raised his bet to $40,000, but lost again. Then he exploded and began to shout and accuse those present of cheating, and then quickly left, promising that they would not receive a cent of the $320,000 he had lost that day. Arnold did not lie. He really was not going to pay, believing that he had been deceived. However, Judge McManus, who, as organizer of the game, was somewhat responsible for Rothstein, was determined to get every penny. Every day, the office of the Big Bankroll began to receive dozens of calls calling for him to pay up, and McManus himself, at each meeting with Rothstein, personally tried to convince him. So, when George called Arnold and invited him to his hotel room, the Big Bankroll did not expect trouble. However, it happened. He went up to McManus's room in the late evening of November 5th and came down less than an hour later with a bullet wound to the stomach. In the lobby of the hotel, he was discovered by a porter who immediately called the police and an ambulance. When law enforcement officers arrived at the hotel, Rothstein did not say a word to them about what had happened. He repeated the same behavior in the hospital, where he was taken by an ambulance. At first glance, this looks strange, since Arnold had previously made reports to the police on offenses directed against him, and he had no special commitment to the criminal code of silence. So let's examine more closely the event that took place. When the police investigation began, at first, a pistol which had been used in the shooting was found below the windows of the hotel, and then, directly in the room where Rothstein went, they found a coat with the initials of George McManus. But after that, strange things began to happen. The prints from the gun disappeared. There were no traces of blood along the entire length of Arnold's path from the room to the lobby, and almost no one was looking for McManus himself, even though he was the main suspect. The impression was given that someone was putting sticks into the wheel of justice. To understand who benefited from this, you need to take a closer look at George McManus, who, as it turned out, had no less influential political connections than Arnold Rothstein. McManus, like Rothstein, was a kind of intermediary between the authorities and the underworld, having important acquaintances in Tammany Hall, which ultimately saved him from prison. although all the evidence and several witnesses clearly pointed to his guilt. Therefore, it's not surprising that Rothstein was silent about the shooter. After all, this would not be evidence against some petty gangster. McManus would certainly have been backed up by Tammany Hall, and this would have threatened the possible loss of his own political patrons. Okay, we figured out why Rothstein was silent and why McManus was eventually acquitted, but what actually happened in the room? If you add up all the testimonies, all the evidence found by the police, as well as the facts that they ignored, then the following chain of events is derived. McManus checked into the hotel on the morning of November 5th, having quarreled with his wife the day before. A little later, 2 associates visited him, with whom he spent a noisy time, pumping himself up with strong drinks. By the evening, having had more than enough to drink, he decided to invite Rothstein to talk. Around 11 p.m., Arnold entered the room. A conversation began, which then turned into raised voices. After that, either McManus himself or one of his friends broke down and pulled out a gun, either intentionally or accidentally shooting Rothstein. And then the associates, dumbfounded by what had happened, throw their weapons out the window and quickly leave the hotel room. It all happened so fast that McManus put on Rothstein's coat, which looks like his own. Then Arnold descended with a wound into the lobby of the hotel, from where he was taken to the hospital, where he would stay for a day. On November 6th, doctors declared the death of Arnold Rothstein due to damage to internal organs. Approximately 600 people were present when he was buried in the Queens Cemetery. The sudden death of the big bankroll caused confusion among the people associated with him. The hunt for his records and documents immediately began, which would cause inconvenience to many important people, and the most cunning close associates immediately snatched up fat pieces of his fortune. But that's a completely different story. This was the biography of Arnold Rothstein, gambler, casino owner, bootlegger, drug dealer, loan shark, and the most notorious venture capitalist in the underworld. During his not-too-long life, he managed to put his hand to everything that would feed the criminal world during the entire 20th century.